Hello guys, this is Coach B with MasterChess.com, and in this video we're going to take a look at positions where the bishop is fighting against a lone pawn. Now these positions are pretty trivial. If the bishop can control any square in front of the pawn, then this position is drawn. So here, after bishop to g6, this is going to be a simple draw. Even if the black king moves to c1, all the bishop has to do is stay on this diagonal and be able to capture the pawn when it's going to promote. So let's say bishop f5, no matter what black does, the bishop all it has to do is stay on this diagonal. And after black promotes the pawn to a queen, the bishop simply takes the queen and this position is drawn. There are cases where the bishop cannot access the square in front of the pawn right away, but the position can still be drawn. This is one of those type of positions. Here with correct play, white is still able to achieve a draw. The correct move here is bishop to b3. After this, it doesn't matter what black will move, the white bishop will be able to gain access to the square in front of the pawn. If the black king moves the king to a1, then the bishop simply comes to c2, and now he's going to be able to stay on that diagonal until the pawn promotes. And if the black king will move the king to c1, then the bishop will come on a2, attacking that square. And now here black doesn't have many options. Either he's going to push the pawn to promote it and then white will simply take it, or he's going to try to use the king to chase away the bishop. So let's say king c2, white can start marching his king down, but as soon as black moves the king to c3, now the bishop can simply come to b1 and gaining access on the diagonal in front of the pawn and then achieve a simple draw. Here's another position where white cannot access the diagonal that will cover a square in front of the pawn simply because of the position of the opponent's king. Here, if white is trying to take control of that diagonal right away, the king will simply take the bishop and then white will not have enough time to catch the pawn before promoting. And coming back from the beginning, bishop to d7 is another try, but it also doesn't work. Here white is thinking that after black pushes the pawn to h2, he's going to be able to come to d8, and now if the pawn promotes to a queen, white will simply skewer the black king and then win the queen. However, this doesn't work because here black, instead of promoting the pawn to a queen, he's going to move the king to c6, taking control of the square b7 that would allow white to control the diagonal in front of the pawn. And now the bishop is stuck because he's not able to take control of that square, and the white king again cannot stop the pawn from promoting. And this position is winning for black. However, coming back from the beginning, this position is drawn. What white has to do is simply check the black king on b3, and here black has a couple of options that none are really great. For example, he can try to move the king to e4 to still control the square d5 that will not allow white to take control of the diagonal in front of the pawn. However, the bishop now will move to a4, trying to reach the square c6 and control that diagonal. And if black is trying to stop him, let's say king to d5, then the bishop can simply check the king again, repeating the position. If black tries to move the king to d6, here the bishop will come to c2 and also eyeing the square e4 to control that diagonal. If black pushes the pawn to h2, after white comes to e4, he's going to be able to stop that pawn from promoting, taking control of that diagonal. And if black is moving his king to e5 to stop that from happening, white will simply move the bishop to a4 again, trying to come to the square c6. And here black cannot make any progress because the black king has to constantly move to guard the squares that would allow the bishop control over the diagonal in front of the pawn, which doesn't give him any time to move his own pawn. Next, we're going to take a look at positions where white has a bishop and a pawn. Now, we know that if white has the wrong color bishop and a rook pawn, that this is a draw if the black king reaches the corner. So after something like bishop to d5 check, after black reaches the square h8 in front of the pawn, this is a draw no matter what white does. But there are positions, such as this one, where even though white has the wrong color bishop and a rook pawn, he is able to win simply because his king is close enough to support the bishop and the pawn. Here, after the bishop moves to h7, together with the pawn they create a wall to push black back, giving white enough time to bring his king closer to the action. After king f6, white will be able to take the opposition on f4, and now black cannot attack the pawn and has no access to the square in front of the pawn. So here, after black pushes back, white can simply go to g5, king f8, king g6, and now black has to just move back. White will come and take control of g7, and now there's nothing that black can do to stop white from promoting. In this next position, white doesn't even need the king to come and help, because after bishop to e6, this creates a wall that will not allow black to go to the pawn. You can see here the bishop takes the diagonals, the squares f7 and g8, and the pawn attacks the square g7. So it's kind of like a wall that separates black from reaching the square h8. And here the only move that black has is to simply retreat, let's say king to e7, from which white can now push the pawn as black is not in the square of the pawn, and there's nothing that black can do to stop him from promoting. And coming back from the beginning, both of these positions, what they had in common was that the pawn was already on the 6th rank, allowing it to work together with the bishop to create a wall and not allowing black to come in front of the pawn. But if white's pawn would be anywhere behind that rank, this position would be drawn, as black would be able to go in front of the pawn. And in the end, I want to go over a few positions where white should have lost the game, but is able to achieve a draw because black pushed the pawn too far. So here white has the pawn on the 2nd rank, and black pushed the pawn all the way to block white's pawn. Well, this position is now drawn. All white has to do is move the king to f1, taking the opposition, and there's nothing that black can do here to win the game. The white king together with the white pawn creates a wall that does not allow black to attack the pawn, and the bishop cannot do anything either. If he checks the king, white can simply move to g1. And if the bishop moves to b5, now white can simply go to h1. Bishop c6, king to g1. Bishop d5, king to f1. King e3, king to g1. And if black moves the king to e2, this is stalemate. And coming back from the beginning, white does have to be careful, because if he moves the king to h1 now, king to f2 here is checkmate. But if white moves the king to f1, there's nothing that black can do to stop him from achieving a draw. With blocked knight pawns on the original square, white is also able to achieve a draw. And there's nothing that black can do here to stop white from getting a draw. After king to g1, if black moves the king to e2, white will move the king to h1, and king f1 is a stalemate. And coming back, if black moves the bishop to b5, stopping white from coming to f1, after white moves in the corner and king f2, this is stalemate again. And it doesn't matter if we switch the color of the bishop, this position is still drawn. After something like king g1, king e2, king h1, king f1 again is stalemate. And if instead of moving the king to f1 reaching stalemate, if black moves the bishop, let's say to c7, here white can simply just come back to g1, and there's nothing that black can do to make progress. So as we've seen in the previous positions, if we play black here, we do not want to push the pawn too far. Here, the correct play after king g1 is something like, let's say, king e2, king h2, king f2, not allowing white to go attack the black's pawn. White will have to move here the king to h1, bishop c7, and now white is forced to move the pawn up as his king is stuck, having no squares to move. And after pawn to g3, the king can take the pawn, king g1, bishop a5, king h1, king h3, king g1, and now black can start pushing the pawn. Pawn to g3, king h1, g2 check, king g1, and now bishop to b6 is checkmate. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.